Hey everybody, Dusty here, back with Crusader Kings 3. Now, one of my favorite aspects of CK3 is how it's constantly generating emergent stories, allowing you to rewrite and make your own mark on history. After all, the history books are filled with tales of daring soldiers, brilliant scientific minds, and accomplished artists whose feats and achievements have continued to inspire others long after their own deaths. But there's more than one way to make your mark on history, and as the seemingly endless demand for documentaries on cult leaders and serial killers can attest to, the only thing that captures the public's imagination more than a noble hero is an equally nefarious villain. And thankfully for all of us who get to enjoy their misdeeds with the distance of hindsight, there's been no shortage of individuals who are willing to play the part. After all, for every Caesar there's a Nero, for every Mother Teresa there's a Ted Bundy, and for every Ulysses S. Grant, well, there's a Ulysses S. Grant.
Each history's greatest monster!
Naturally, I thought it would be fun to see if I could join their infamous ranks, so allow me to introduce you all to Rodbert of House Dust, the Duke of East Anglia. Rodbert is a reclusive, drunken, sadistic, and paranoid petty tyrant whose first instinct when faced with a dispute between two of his vassals is to chop both their heads off and just be done with it, so he isn't exactly beloved by his subjects. In fact, he's so hated that when he decides to settle down and is looking for a spouse, his options among the nobility are extremely limited, not to mention problematic. Plus, on a practical level, when you're as hated as Rodbert, it just seems smart to acquire a spouse who can pop out an heir as quickly as possible, and thankfully the commoners are far less picky, and the lustful Siaxper is willing to bite the bullet in order to escape her poverty. Although despite her kind words, I can't exactly say she looks thrilled about the whole situation. Now, the early days of Rodbert's reign also coincided with that whole Norman conquest of England, which the Duke of East Anglia was more than happy to sit out and spectate from the sidelines.
Because I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
And it was a wise decision, as when William took to the throne, he named Rodbert as his marshal, which seemed like a massive waste of his talents, although Rodbert did get to play the part of a soldier and prove himself a little when he led his personal army against a small force of Norwegian invaders. Not long after this, Siaxper began showing signs she was pregnant, and a few months later gave birth to the couple's first child, Agatha. Now, typically, this would be a cause for celebration, but paranoid as ever, Rodbert soon decreed that his new heir should be placed under house arrest so that she couldn't be used as the figurehead for any would-be usurpers out there. And that paranoia also led Rodbert to suspect Siaxper of cheating on him once it became clear that they'd be expecting a second child. He never found any proof of her infidelity, but his accusations would strain their already uneasy relationship. So sometime later, when he was out enjoying drinks with his spymaster Eadberg and she offered to introduce him to the lovely Mildred, Rodbert eagerly jumped on the opportunity, and before long, the wild night of passion had blossomed into a full-on affair, and having grown tired of Siaxper, he looked to make this new entanglement far more official. However, there was one small issue, as the Pope decided to stick his big nose in Rodbert's business and wouldn't grant the Duke the right to divorce. However, unlike some leaders, Rodbert didn't throw a tantrum and decide to make a church of his own.
With blackjack and hookers. In fact, forget the lunar lander and the blackjack!
But instead decided to be proactive and framed Siaxper for being a sexual deviant to tank her social standing, which you would think would be pretty viable grounds for divorce, but apparently the Pope disagreed. However, while His Holiness might have had the power to force someone to stay married to their current spouse, that no longer applied if you suddenly found yourself a widower, and since Siaxper's apparent depraved sexual appetites were already common knowledge, Rodbert had the perfect excuse to send her off to the executioner and have Mildred take her place by his side. Naturally, Agatha and her sister Eadgifu weren't thrilled by this new development, but they weren't in much of a position to make their complaints heard at the moment. There was some slight hope that his new nuptials had thawed Rodbert's icy heart a little, as not long after the ceremony, both of his daughters were freed from the confines of their house arrest, although it soon became apparent that this was mainly for political purposes, as Eadgifu was swiftly sent over to the much more powerful neighboring realm of Mercia in an exchange of hostages, and this apathy and disregard toward his own immediate family did little to endear him to his citizens and likely contributed to his popular nickname of Rodbert the Terrible. And predictably, despite the passionate start to their relationship, it doesn't take long before Rodbert grows a little bored of Mildred and secretly begins planning a new romantic conquest, settling upon the affable Haziga, the Countess of Rothenburg. And although he might have been a wretched little weasel, Rodbert was capable of turning on the charm, and Haziga eventually finds herself falling under his creepy little spell. Understandably, once Haziga's husband Otto learned that she'd been sleeping around behind his back, he wasn't too thrilled about the whole development, but sensing an opportunity, he had the bright idea to use this knowledge to attempt to blackmail Rodbert.
You serious?
news!
However, if Otto wanted to expose himself for having been unwittingly cuckolded, then the Duke of East Anglia had no issue with that. Completely emasculated, Otto then threw Haziga into the dungeon in an attempt to save whatever face he could, and that was his first major mistake because it put him directly in Herodbert's crosshairs. His second blunder would be allowing Herodbert to pay off Haziga's ransom because hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and once she was released from confinement, she happily joined Herodbert's plot to take out Otto so that she would be free to home wreck to her heart's content. But if you've been paying attention, then you probably won't be shocked to learn that Herodbert's interest in Haziga soon began to wane, which wasn't helped by the fact that by this point, Mildred had given him a male heir Maccus, who Herodbert now had to worry about. So when the stress of juggling two lovers started to become a little too inconvenient, he coldly cut off Haziga, officially ending things with her. And to add insult to insult, Herodbert had fathered one of her children back when they were still making plans to take out Otto, and if you're expecting a deadbeat like Herodbert to take responsibility, well... Now you would think that the Catholic Church would be happy to learn that Herodbert had quit openly defying their God by engaging in adultery, but his reward for doing so was that his priest Ael accused him of being in an incestuous marriage with Mildred, and given all of his other well-documented debaucheries, the public happily ate up these slanderous fabrications. Ael wouldn't get to gloat about his victory for long though, as he'd quickly find his head next on the chopping block. But the overzealous old preacher may have gotten off easy, as Herodbert later discovered that one of his courtiers possesses some peculiar dining habits and has been forcing his host to unknowingly partake as well.
Silent breed is people!
And unfortunately for everybody else, the sick son of a bitch wasn't too upset over this discovery. So in addition to being a murderous psychopath, serial cheater, negligent and downright abusive parent, alleged cousin fucker, and violent coercive hoodlum, you could now add a literal bloodthirsty cannibal onto his list of crimes against humanity. And if you're wondering why nobody ever stepped up to oppose his reign, well, apparently Machiavelli was spot on when he claimed it's better to be feared than loved. Peasants were afraid that anytime they stepped down a dark alley or were out on a hunt, that they'd end up being ambushed by the king's men and served up on his dinner table, while his talent for manipulating his peers and dreadful reputation made neighboring rulers extra reluctant to invoke his wrath. I mean, even the man's dinner parties had a tendency to end in bloodshed, and that's not even taking into account what was going on back in the kitchen. And the royal family could never be bothered to intervene because the years following the death of William the Conqueror had been a tumultuous time that had seen many of Herodbert's peers attempt to limit the crown's influence, so the fact that Herodbert wasn't openly campaigning to commit treason meant that he seemed like the least of their worries.
The lie detector determined that was a lie.
However, a quiet man harbors the most secrets, and unknown to everybody, Herodbert had recently developed a desire to feast upon the flesh of a monarch, and when the young King William II took to the throne, he suddenly found himself presented with the perfect opportunity that he simply couldn't pass up. Now you might think that having the king suddenly being imprisoned by one of his dukes and served up as an appetizer would cause a major incident, but if anybody had any issues with it, then they kept it to themselves, as William's younger brother was promptly named as his successor, with Herodbert even being appointed as his Majesty's new spy master. Everybody had clearly just resigned themselves to the harsh reality that Herodbert was free to indulge himself in whichever manner he pleased, and all they could do was pray that they weren't somehow involved. By this point, it seemed like the only thing that could bring an end to Herodbert's tyranny was some divine intervention. Now, I can't imagine a plague of biblical proportions is exactly what most people in East Anglia had been hoping for, but when word got out that Herodbert had been afflicted, you'd have to think that the rest of England let out a sigh of relief. However, defiant as ever, Herodbert wasn't gonna let something like a little tuberculosis take him out. Sadly for him though, Mildred and Maccus wouldn't prove to be as resilient and succumb to their illness, and it turns out that even monsters can have feelings. Despite his casual mistreatment of his family, he had apparently grown somewhat fond of them and had actually took the loss pretty hard. And to add on to his worries, the unexpected death of Maccus meant that he now suddenly found himself without a son to carry on his legacy, and thanks to all the atrocities that he'd committed throughout the years, his marriage options were more limited than ever before. Now, he had schemed up a workaround for this, as he had intended to kidnap a countess, murder her husband, and then attempt to win her over after forcibly recruiting her to serve in his court. But luckily for Adelise, all of the pressure Herodbert now found himself under finally took its toll, and the man would suffer from a fatal stroke, allowing the unassuming Agatha to assume the title of the Duchess of East Anglia. There was some initial concerns that the sins of her father could be held against her, but considering that the worst of her offenses was engaging in a steamy little affair with the King of Scotland, happened, everybody was just relieved not to have an insane madman lording over them, so no attempts at retribution were ever made. Still, while there might have been some optimism for the future of House Dust under its new leader, East Anglia would never forget the turbulent reign of Roderick the Terrible, and his name would be invoked by parents to strike fear into the hearts of unruly children for generations to come. What is up, people? Dusty here, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I've got no clue why you're still here. Like, what are you even doing? But if you did enjoy it, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel to be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. I'm out.